Before him shimmered a curtain of light, rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond, yet perfectly vertical, almost inviting. Scientists in starched lab coats, soldiers with tight grips on their rifles, and technicians adjusting dials all looked on, their expressions tense, unsure if they were about to witness history or tragedy. Andrew took a deep breath, repeating the mantra his trainers had drilled into him over endless nights of hypnotic conditioning. Calm your heart. Calm your mind. You are safe. Then he stepped forward. Instantly, the world around him blurred and dissolved. Cold needles of pressure crawled over his skin, prickling through every pore. For a moment, there was nothing but the shriek of 1,000 whispers in his skull, like wind blowing through a broken organ pipe. Then came the sudden slam of solid earth under his boots, wet and freezing. Andrew found himself in a muddy field under a sky the color of tarnished pewter. The cold wind cut through the wool of his uniform like knives, and the boots squelched in muck that clung to him as if trying to pull him under. Around him, hundreds of men, women, and children stood waiting, faces solemn, their clothes smelling of smoke, earth, and sweat. Soldiers stood guard with bayonets, their expressions hard but haunted. Andrew had trained for this moment for weeks. Every morning, he recited the day's historical significance, the date, the speeches, the cultural codes, drilled so deeply into his mind that it felt as if he had been born to stand here. He took a careful breath, searching through the fog of vertigo, and made out a hastily constructed wooden stage rising above the churned mud. Standing atop it was a man who seemed taller than any living person, wrapped in a black coat, a stovepipe hat perched precariously on his head. The air around him seemed to tremble with the weight of history itself. November 19th, 1863. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Abraham Lincoln about to deliver the Gettysburg Address. Andrew swallowed, steadying his small hands, which trembled uncontrollably despite his training. This was why he had come. His arrival was not random, nor was it an accident. It was the culmination of a plan set into motion decades earlier, the echoes of a secret that had begun with a genius inventor, a lonely hotel room, and a series of boxes that were never meant to see the light of day. Tesla's legacy and the missing boxes, Nikola. Tesla, a brilliant visionary decades ahead of his time, had died alone in a shabby hotel room in New York City in 1943. Though his name had once commanded awe, the world had turned its back on his more esoteric ideas, branding him an eccentric. Yet to those in the know, to the hidden corners of government, to agencies desperate to conquer the future, Tesla's death was not the end, but the beginning. When officials entered his hotel room, they found Tesla's lifeless body surrounded by chaotic piles of papers, stacks of diagrams, fragile models of unknown devices, and pages of formulae so complex they seemed written in a lost language. Cataloged and boxed, they were taken away under the authority of the Office of Alien Property, a bland name belying its true purpose. Officially, there were 80 boxes of material. Unofficially, 20 of those vanished into a hidden current of classified channels, spirited away to facilities where unmarked trucks came and went in the dead of night. Tesla had dreamed of harnessing invisible energy fields, of transmitting power without wires, of tapping into the very vacuum of space, the so-called zero-point energy. His wildest theories, dismissed by academia, suggested that time itself could be manipulated through the resonance of powerful electromagnetic fields. For years after his death, those missing boxes were left to gather dust, too advanced to understand and too dangerous to destroy. But the start of the Cold War changed everything. The Cold War, DARPA, and secret technology. After the Soviets stunned the world with Sputnik in 1957, the United States entered a feverish race to reclaim technological supremacy. The government, terrified of falling behind, launched the Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, with a mission to push the boundaries of science, no matter how strange or speculative. Buried in the back of a classified warehouse, Tesla's missing files were reviewed with new eyes. Physicists, engineers, and intelligence officers pored over the cryptic diagrams and scrawled notes. Among the chaos, they found sketches of 2 metal pillars with copper coils, positioned exactly 10 feet apart, described as temporal harmonic resonators. The blueprints hinted that between these pillars, a field could be generated capable of disrupting the flow of time itself. The math seemed impossible yet tantalizing. DARPA engineers working with military contractors quietly built a rough prototype, When first activated, the device produced a low hum unlike any known frequency, a pulsing thrum that rattled bones and set teeth on edge. Between the pillars shimmered a wavering mirage, like heat rippling off desert roads, but accompanied by a bone-deep chill that made the air feel brittle. They had no idea what they had created, but they had to know more. First experiments and horrific results. The initial tests were cautious, using inanimate objects, a metal lunchbox, a pocket watch, a standard-issue army backpack. These returned altered, corroded, warped, their surfaces pitted as if they had been left to weather centuries. Seeing this partial success, the program's leaders felt emboldened. The political pressure to produce results was enormous. If they could move objects through time, what was next? Could they send people? The first human subjects were volunteers. Soldiers promised bonuses and medals, never told the real odds of survival. The first man reappeared, screaming, his skin as pale as paper, eyes rolled back in terror. The next returned missing half of his body, neatly sliced as if reality itself had misaligned. Others simply vanished. Of the first 15, 3 returned more or less intact, but with minds shattered. They spoke of unimaginable horrors, endless tunnels twisting through nowhere, voices that spoke backwards, living shadows that followed them. They called it the space between. Doctors tried to treat their wounds, but how do you mend a mind that has seen infinity? The survivors drooled, rocked in corners, or clawed their own faces, unable to comprehend the ordinary world anymore. Investigators documented terrifying details: accelerated aging, cells decaying without known cause, memories scrambled beyond repair. It was as if the travelers had been torn apart and reassembled incorrectly. The program seemed on the verge of collapse, a monstrous failure destined to be buried forever, until a strange pattern emerged. The child hypothesis and Andrew's first mission among the wreckage of lives and minds. The scientists noticed something curious. The youngest soldiers, barely adults, showed fewer breakdowns. Their brains, still flexible, still able to adapt, seemed to weather the shock of temporal dislocation better than those whose minds had fully matured. Theorists called this the child hypothesis, that the malleable consciousness of children might survive the journey where hardened adult minds could not. In desperation, or hubris, one of the project's senior engineers made a horrifying decision. He volunteered his own son, Andrew. Andrew was tested for weeks. Doctors examined every corner of his mind, looking for weaknesses. Trainers drilled him in calmness, meditation, focus. Hypnotists taught him to slow his heartbeat, to detach from fear, to sink into a trance where reality could bend without shattering. Short-range trials came first, measured in dozens of feet, then a single city block. Each time, Andrew came back whole, shaken but whole. Finally, they chose his true mission, Gettysburg, 1863. A day burned into the timeline, observed by thousands, its coordinates stable and reliable. Andrew went through the shimmering field, the hum of the machine singing in his bones, and stepped into history. He returned minutes later, shaken but alive, his boots heavy with 19th century mud, the smell of wood smoke clinging to his coat. His voice was steady as he described Lincoln's words, the fear in the crowd, the sense of a nation on the brink. Andrew had done what no one else could. He had walked through time and survived. Expansion of the Chrono program. Andrew's miraculous return, both physically unharmed and mentally intact, triggered a frenzy of activity behind closed doors. Within days, word spread among the secret circles of military brass, intelligence officers, and civilian contractors. Time travel was no longer a fringe theory. It was a working, if terrifying, technology. The Chrono program, as it became known in classified briefings, underwent a massive expansion. Recruiting officers quietly reached out to trusted military families, searching for children with exceptional cognitive abilities, physical resilience, and an uncanny adaptability. Families were offered sealed contracts, thick with legal language and peppered with generous financial promises. They were told their children would serve a grand mission, one that could safeguard the very future of the nation. Some parents, frightened yet loyal, agreed. Others resisted, only to find their protests buried under a mountain of non-disclosure threats. In a Cold War world where suspicion colored every conversation, the Chrono program's recruiters usually got what they wanted. The children, no older than 8, no younger than 6, were brought to secluded facilities camouflaged among airfields or industrial plants. There, they were reshaped into something that hovered between soldier, scholar, and spy. Their days were filled with relentless drills, hours of meditation to strengthen mental focus, hypnosis sessions to implant reflexive calm under stress, rigorous physical conditioning to toughen their bodies against disorienting jumps. In addition, the children were immersed in history. Their trainers ensured they knew how to blend seamlessly into whatever era they would visit, how to talk, how to bow or stand, how to hold cutlery, how to salute. Costumers designed perfect replicas of clothes from ancient Rome to Napoleonic France, right down to hand-stitched seams. At night, these young trainees lay in rows of bunk beds in cavernous dormitories, their minds pulsing with fragmented images of centuries they had yet to see. Some cried into their thin pillows, terrified of dreams where time fractured, where a wrong step might mean a permanent trap in a world that could never be their own. But the program would not slow down. After all, it had proof that the method worked. The rise of the Chrono Explorer soon, Andrew was no longer alone. Dozens of other children were trained, tested, and sent on their first missions. They traveled in small teams, codenamed by Greek letters, Alpha, Beta, Gamma. Each team had a primary goal: record history, verify consistency, and return without causing disruption. Yet history, they learned quickly, was never still. Andrew advanced into a leadership role almost by default. Having survived more jumps than any other, he carried a strange authority, a gravity beyond his years. Younger recruits looked to him for calm, for instructions on how to steady a racing heart before stepping through the time field. His fourth mission to Gettysburg changed everything. There, as he scanned the perimeter near the wooden stage, he locked eyes with a familiar face. A boy half his age, wide-eyed and shaking. Andrew froze. The boy was him years ago on his first mission. It was a closed loop, a circuit of time folding back on itself. After returning, Andrew struggled for days to find meaning in what he had witnessed. He knew, in the rational part of his mind, that his encounter meant the timeline was consistent. But another part of him, a deeper part, felt as if he had been watching himself die and be reborn all at once. Other children reported similar fractures in their sense of self. A girl, Maria, who had been sent to Pearl Harbor, described seeing 3 versions of herself running in different directions as bombs fell. A boy called David described witnessing his own death during the Antietam campaign, only to realize it was an echo of another possible thread of his existence. These events terrified the program's overseers. Their precisely measured experiments were slipping into chaos, splicing into timelines that no longer behaved like fixed stories, but like tangled roots of an ancient tree, endlessly branching. The word echo branches began to appear in classified reports, as scientists debated if these were errors in the technology or natural consequences of time's elasticity. Either way, the conclusion was unavoidable. The program was not simply recording history, it was rewriting it. Ethical quakes, a dark current of doubt began to flow within the project. A small number of psychologists and researchers quietly raised concerns. Was it morally acceptable to use children as living test subjects, pushed through psychological trauma most adults could barely survive? But the Chrono program was shielded by the highest levels of secrecy. Outsiders would never hear of these protests. Whistleblowers were reassigned to remote bases or removed altogether. The argument from the program's leaders was simple. The stakes were too high. Soviet scientists, they warned, might be working on similar breakthroughs. If the United States did not master temporal exploration first, it might lose its advantage forever. Still, some voices refused to be silenced. One medical officer, whose name was carefully erased from all later files, left behind a journal describing the agony of treating children whose minds cracked from too many timeline jumps. The pages were smudged with tears and handwritten confessions of moral horror. "What are we doing?" he wrote in one entry. "We have turned innocence into a weapon." But the program, like a vast machine with no brakes, rolled forward. Encounters with temporal anomalies. As the children's missions expanded, from Gettysburg to ancient Athens, from the trenches of Verdun to the windswept Mongolian steppe, the evidence of temporal anomalies only multiplied. There were reports of missing children reappearing decades later, unchanged, claiming they had been stuck in an endless corridor of shifting doors. Another described being trapped in the Fold, a featureless black plane where time stood still until a familiar voice called him back through the shimmer. Andrew, now nearly 14, found himself haunted by memories he could not place. There were flashes of marble halls lit by oil lamps, of conversations in languages he had never consciously learned. Sometimes he dreamed of lives that felt real but could not be verified, as if each jump left pieces of other timelines lodged in his mind. Some of the children began to wonder if they were still themselves at all. If you visited a dozen eras, met your future self, and stood beside your past self, who were you really? Their trainers tried to keep them grounded with mantras and breathing exercises. But no mantra could erase the deeper dread that their identities were dissolving into a patchwork of history. Andrew, in particular, felt the weight of this fracturing. One night, sitting on the edge of his bunk, he confessed to a fellow explorer, "I don't know which parts of me are real anymore." His friend looked back, hollow-eyed, and said nothing. The shift toward Mars by. The late 1970s, the Chrono program's momentum had shifted again. Rumors swirled that the device's calibration, when tweaked with Tesla's obscure equations and experimental frequencies, had achieved something new, spatial as well as temporal travel. The so-called jump rooms were born, ordinary-looking chambers whose copper-lined walls thrummed with otherworldly resonance. Tests showed they could bend not only when, but where the subject emerged. Early attempts to use these jump rooms for intercontinental travel were promising. A subject could move from the American East Coast to the Soviet steppe in seconds. But then, a technician accidentally tuned the coordinates far beyond anything expected. The result was stunning. A human subject emerged, gasping and delirious on the surface of Mars. At first, mission planners thought it was a hallucination. But after probes confirmed atmospheric composition, terrain features, and even crumbling structures, the impossible became undeniable. Mars was real, reachable, and shockingly familiar. The leap to Mars, the discovery of a stable route to Mars, electrified the Chrono program's leadership. What had begun as an exercise in rewriting history had become a project to transcend the boundaries of the solar system itself. There were debates, intense and sometimes venomous, over what the next steps should be. Should they share the discovery with NASA or the broader public? Should they inform the president directly? The answer was predictable. Secrecy must hold. If knowledge of this technology fell into the wrong hands, or any hands at all, it could cause a geopolitical earthquake. And so, under layers of black budgets and compartmentalized security clearances, the Mars Initiative took shape. Andrew, now 17, was chosen for the first full human exploration mission. Having survived countless temporal jumps and adapted to alien cultures across history, he was considered uniquely prepared to face what Mars might hold. His training intensified. Along with standard jump protocols, he learned wilderness survival under harsh atmospheric conditions, emergency triage, and combat strategies against unknown threats. He and 5 other explorers underwent months of rehearsals inside a mocked-up Martian base, complete with dusty red soils, lower atmospheric pressure, and a simulated weaker gravity. They drilled how to handle alien pathogens, how to respond to psychological dislocation, and how to maintain sanity in a place beyond the reach of Earth. Andrew could barely sleep the night before the first Martian jump. Flashes of past missions flickered through his mind. Lincoln's voice, the rattle of cannon fire, the stinging slap of mud in Civil War trenches. All of that felt strangely simpler compared to what lay ahead. When the jump sequence engaged, Andrew felt the now familiar squeeze of his atoms drawn through the machine's quantum resonance. And then, in the blink of a heartbeat, he was there. Mars. An endless horizon stretched before him. Ochre cliffs, massive canyons, strange formations that looked like the bones of titanic beasts. The sky, tinged with a faint peach hue, pulsed gently with light from a shrunken sun. Andrew took a cautious breath, surprised to find the air thin but breathable, exactly as probes had indicated. Most shocking of all were the ruins. Monolithic stone structures rose from the sands, carved with elaborate symbols that defied any earthly language, yet held a haunting familiarity. Obelisks, taller than cathedral spires, stood half-buried in dunes. Entrances to subterranean halls yawned open, black as the abyss. Andrew was seized by a feeling of deep reverence, as if stepping into a cathedral where gods had once walked. The team's radio chatter broke through his trance. They began taking samples, scanning rock layers, peering into those mysterious underground passages. But the sense of being watched never left them. Life on Mars and alien contact within days, Andrew's team found signs of movement. Tracks across dust, shallow and recent, traced winding paths around the ruins. And one night they saw them. Humanoid shapes, thin and impossibly tall, their skin pale and almost luminous under the Martian sky. Large black eyes dominated their elongated faces, reflecting the explorers like mirrors. They never spoke, but moved with a flowing grace that felt almost choreographed. Their gestures seemed to communicate, not through language, but through a universal empathy, a silent exchange of emotion that was somehow clear. Andrew would later write that meeting these beings was like staring into an ancient myth. They were terrifying and beautiful at once, beings out of time and out of place. Other life forms roamed as well. Monstrous spider-like creatures that scuttled over dunes, massive reptilian shapes that floated through canyons with eerie silence, as if gravity obeyed them differently. The ruins themselves felt alive, humming faintly in some unknowable frequency, almost responding to the presence of visitors. Walls were carved with symbols reminiscent of Earth's most sacred shapes. Spirals, eyes, interlocking patterns that suggested not random art but language. Andrew suspected a forgotten truth, that perhaps long before Earth's civilizations emerged, Mars had flourished. Its children had crossed to Earth, seeding something in human cultures. The echoes of gods, the myths of ancient visitors, perhaps all pointed back to these Martian ancestors. As the missions repeated, a pattern emerged. The explorers were not just visitors. They were, in some sense, pilgrims. The beings on Mars watched them, assessed them, but never harmed them. It felt as if the explorers had been expected. Andrew grew increasingly convinced that the secrets of Mars could change everything humanity believed about itself. Trauma and loss, not every mission returned intact. One boy, Leo, vanished into a subterranean chamber and was never seen again. Another, an older teenager named Samuel, came back from a Martian jump wild-eyed and raving, clawing at his own skin until medics had to sedate him. He never spoke a coherent word again. Some children returned with frostbite-like burns on their hands, as if they had touched something impossibly cold. Others described vivid hallucinations of towering entities made of shadow and light. The Chrono program's medical teams tried to manage the damage, patching up bodies and minds as best they could. But even the best psychiatric therapy could not fully restore the innocence lost on red alien soil. Andrew himself had nightmares. Visions of crumbling red cities, of starships rotting under Martian sands, of endless corridors filled with whispering echoes. Sometimes he wondered if those dreams were only dreams, or memories. Eyewitnesses and whistleblowers in time, pieces of the Chrono program leaked to the outside world. A handful of those child recruits, now grown, risked speaking out. They described the same details: the copper pillars, the jump rooms, the taste of blood from nosebleeds after jumps, the crushing silence of Mars. One woman claimed to have seen the same pale Martian observers as Andrew. A man in his 40s spoke on a late-night radio show of seeing massive stone temples with writing he could still draw from memory. Their stories resonated with each other, eerily consistent despite decades of separation. Photographs emerged, too, strange images from historical archives. One showed a boy in Union blue standing near Lincoln's podium, boots comically oversized, his haircut all wrong for the era. Historians puzzled over it for years, unable to match him to any known identity. Whispers said it was Andrew. Intelligence officials moved quickly to bury these accounts, discrediting witnesses with ridicule or subtle threats. Some potential whistleblowers simply disappeared. Still, the stories would not die. They spread through conspiracy circles, through secret-sharing forums, and through hushed bar conversations, carried by the sense that no matter how bizarre, they were rooted in a deeper truth. The ethics and psychological consequences. As public curiosity grew, a few academics began to dig deeper. If the stories were even partly true, they suggested a program that had exploited children on a terrifying scale. Moral weight of that realization was staggering. Psychologists argued about the after-effects of subjecting children to repeated temporal dislocation and alien encounters. Trauma counselors warned that such experiences could fracture a developing identity beyond repair. Some former child explorers recounted never being able to feel truly present again, as if part of their soul was still stuck somewhere else. Their lives were haunted by a constant low-level dread, a sense of otherness that no therapy could soothe. Andrew himself, now an adult, sometimes felt like a ghost walking among people who had no idea what he had seen. His dreams were filled with moments he could not share, and the burden of secrets that might unravel the world if ever fully revealed. The socio-political mirror. In the decades that followed, the Chrono program became a ghost story for those on the fringes of intelligence communities. Its existence was neither fully proven nor fully denied, leaving a wound of suspicion festering across generations. Politicians, activists, and underground journalists whispered of unspeakable experiments on children, of science weaponized not for progress, but for power. For those who tried to investigate, the program was like smoke, impossible to grasp. Funding trails ended in black budgets. Project names were changed every few years, and anyone who asked the wrong questions found themselves reassigned, discredited, or in some tragic cases, permanently silenced. The pattern mirrored countless historical abuses. People drew comparisons to MK Ultra, a program that had once seemed like science fiction until declassified documents proved otherwise. If the government had once drugged its own citizens to break their minds, why wouldn't it also break the timeline itself, if it meant victory over an enemy? Every revelation about the Chrono program, whether real or imagined, became a cultural mirror. It forced people to ask where their loyalties should lie. With the truth, no matter how terrible, or with a narrative designed to preserve their illusions of safety. In a way, the Chrono program was the ultimate Cold War nightmare, a secret so potent, so horrific, that even acknowledging it would upend the social order. Cultural implications of a Martian past. If the ruins on Mars truly represented an intelligent, advanced civilization, then the entire story of humanity would require rewriting. Religions would be challenged to reinterpret doctrines. Philosophers would question what it meant to be human if we had never been alone in the universe. Historians would be forced to look again at Earth's ancient wonders, the pyramids, Stonehenge, the Nazca Lines, and ask whether these too had been seeded by a people from another world. Did our ancestors mistake flesh and blood travelers for gods? Art would change as well. Films, literature, and sculpture would shift to incorporate a new cosmic kinship, dissolving the lines between alien and ancestor. Science fiction would become effectively an extension of the history classroom. Cultural institutions would fracture under the weight of these revelations. Some would cling desperately to tradition, terrified of what the new truths meant. Others would embrace the unknown, eager to step into a broader cosmic family. Governments would scramble to control the narrative, fearful of how their populations might react to the knowledge that Earth was not the cradle of intelligence it once seemed. No matter how carefully they tried to manage the story, though, one thing was inevitable. Once the truth came to light, humanity would never see itself the same way again. Truth or psychological projection? Skeptics had every reason to doubt. Memory is fragile, easily molded by suggestion or trauma. Could children exposed to unthinkable psychological stress have invented stories about time travel and Martian gods as a coping mechanism? Or had they truly seen what they described, returning home with their minds torn by contact with a reality no one else was prepared to accept? Forensic psychologists studied the consistency of the stories. When witnesses separated by thousands of miles and decades described the same jump rooms, the same copper pillars, the same pale beings on Mars, it became difficult to attribute all of it to shared hallucination. But no absolute proof survived. Or if it did, it was buried beyond reach. This ambiguity turned the Chrono program into a modern myth, a riddle that refused to be solved. The power of wonder and imagination. Ultimately, the Chrono program, real or not, captured something timeless in the human spirit. People want to believe there is more beyond the horizon, that history is full of secret doorways, that our ancestors might have been shaped by cosmic visitors, or that our future is still as wide open as the stars. Andrew's story became a kind of parable, retold around campfires and in internet forums, repeated in the pages of cheap conspiracy magazines and discussed on late-night radio shows. It held the same place in the cultural imagination as Atlantis or the lost colony of Roanoke. A tantalizing what if, a possibility that made ordinary life feel less ordinary. Even if the program had never existed, the idea of it reminded people to question their world, to wonder who pulls the levers behind official truths, to ask whether we might be capable of traveling through time or stepping onto other worlds, if only we had the courage to break the rules of reality itself. In that sense, the Chrono program, and Andrew's journey in particular, became more than a secret military operation. It became folklore, a reminder that curiosity, for all its dangers, is what makes us human. Final reflection, Andrew, now grown, sometimes sat alone in quiet places, reflecting on a life lived across centuries and worlds. The memories had fused into a patchwork too tangled to fully separate. Some days he felt like a child still, afraid of the dark, missing home. Other days he felt ancient, carrying memories of Martian tombs and Roman battles, of presidents and alien monarchs. In the mirror he saw a face that belonged to no single era. Lines etched by stress, eyes too old for any young man, scars that would never show on a medical chart. He tried once to live a normal life. Simple apartment, a dull office job, microwave dinners, and television. But the dreams would not stop. The smell of copper, the rush of folding time, the cold peach skies of Mars. They haunted him, reminders that his story was too large to ever fit into a single lifetime. Yet there was a spark in him that refused to die. A sense that no matter how twisted the past had become, the future remained unwritten, and in some strange way, waited for him. Maybe, Andrew thought, all of this had been a preparation. Maybe the universe still had tasks for him to finish, and if it did, he would be ready. He would step through the shimmer again, boots scuffed with 1,000 miles of time and space, and face whatever lay on the other side. Because in the end, he was not just a survivor, he was a traveler. And the story of the human spirit, of courage, wonder, and defiance, would live on through him wherever and whenever he went.